Inside this sprawling 1 million square foot factory,
I'm going to show you what we're doing.
Pat Tucker is helping to fight the war on the coronavirus.
I'd rather save lives than sit at home.
The 55-year-old grandmother, one of over 100 Ford employees working round the clock to build these desperately needed face shields.
And it just goes on like this.
For everyone's safety, we gave one of our cameras to Tucker for this exclusive look inside.
I really hope what we're doing makes a difference.
While all these workers are paid, they're also volunteers, agreeing to leave their families and homes each day, putting their own safety on the line.
Everything is 6 foot apart. We're all wearing these. We're staying pretty separated. Everybody's washing their hands over and over again. My youngest granddaughter lives with me, and I'd be devastated if I gave her something. But if I can help others, I like helping others.
The days are long, 10-hour shifts, 7 days a week. But Tucker says they're assembling a new mask every 10 seconds.
Like I said, 10 seconds save a life.
In the same building, one of Ford's top engineers has been working around the clock on something that may be even bigger. Adrian Price is vowing that Ford will make 50,000 ventilators in 100 days, teaming up with GE and Aeron, a small ventilator manufacturer in Florida. Their simple device uses no electricity and retails for about $7,000. It's already approved by the FDA to save lives.
It is a slightly different business, but at the end of the day, we're manufacturing and assembling products.
Uncle Sam's front lines and production lines swing into high gear.
During World War II, Detroit's automakers came to the rescue.
For the first time, Ford's mass production technique is applied to making bombers.
By the end of the war, Ford was able to turn out a new B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Before the coronavirus shut down their production, Ford was assembling a new F-150 truck every minute. Price intends to bring some of that same speed to the manufacture of ventilators.
If you think about an F-150, it has 7,500 parts typically that we assemble in our facilities. In one of our F-150 seats, there's more than 500 different components.
The Aeron ventilator uses about 400 parts. Price says they hope to make as many as 1,000 per day by this summer.
Our production system, as you know, started with Henry Ford back in the day when he created the first continuously moving assembly line. And that knowledge is at the core of everything we do.
A car comes off the end of the line every 10 seconds.
Ford tells us they're sending out 40,000 face shields a day and hope to do many more. Pat Tucker and her co-workers can already see the results of their hard work.
You know what really helps is when we get the pictures from the hospitals.
As you can see, Henry Ford Emergency Room says thank you. And it's nice that they're sharing this with us. I'm happy to help. I mean, if they get another idea for us to make some, I'm going to be here.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.